So in the last video, I gave you a very gentle introduction to some of the core components in Laravel. And that would include the routing, which is in the app/http directory. And we set up some routes and then learned about how they dispatch to our controller methods, which in turn load views. So now all of this is still a little bit new, so let's stick with it a little bit more, and in the process, learn about how we can pass variables to our views. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start totally from scratch. I'm going to delete everything within our routes file, and the same will be true for these two controllers. Okay, so how do we go about creating a new controller? If you remember in the last lesson, I talked about how for static pages, it can be useful to have some kind of generic pages controller. So for example, if the user requests an about page, example.com/about, we want to send them to a pages controller and a method on it called about. Now, before we move on to the next step, I want to show you something. Imagine if we kept it just like this and tried to view it in the browser. Well, we try it and we get this error page, but it doesn't give us any information as to what went wrong. And that's because Laravel and most frameworks make use of this concept of environments. In this environment, I want to use that special database, I don't actually want to fire off emails, and I want to use this form of error handling. But for production, well, we don't want to show the errors to the user, so we need different configuration for that environment. So right now, because everything is assuming production, well, it's keeping you safe. It's not giving all of your private server information and details to the user. But like I said, for development, we actually want to see that stuff. So here's all you have to do. We're going to talk about environment configuration a lot more in future lessons. So for now, you'll see this .env.example file. All you got to do is rename it to .env, and that'll take effect. And mostly, don't worry about most of the things here. I'll teach you all about those in the future. But specifically notice that now we're setting our app environment not to production, but to local. So if we were to come back and refresh, now we have a little more information to debug our application. And of course, in this case, a pages controller file doesn't exist. So that's our next step. Now, it's true we could manually create this controller, but that's sort of time consuming, right? Instead, we're going to use Laravel's command line utility, which we call Artisan. Let me show you. If we run php artisan, you'll find a few dozen different commands that we can use. Specifically though, we want one of the generators. I want to make a controller, so that's the command we use. php artisan make controller called pages controller. Now you have two options here. If I run it, and if we switch back and take a look at our generated file, it includes a bunch of different methods here. And this is to accommodate what we would call resourceful routing, which you and I haven't reviewed just yet. So instead, I'm going to delete this and try again, but I'm going to add this flag here, or you can think of it as an option. I just want a plain controller. So now, if we give that another try, we just have some quick boilerplate here to get us started. Now, that begs the question, if you're ever wondering, well, how do I know what options I can pass to these commands? You can always precede the command name with the word help. So php artisan, and I need help for the make controller command. And now it'll tell you, here is the argument you need to pass, and any flags or options are listed below it. All right, so back in the routes file, we want to dispatch to an about method on our controller. So that's our next step. Create a method called about, and we'll just return about page for now, and view it in the browser. So if we come back and refresh, as easy as that. This stuff just isn't rocket science. But as we learned in the last video, you probably don't want to return a string. You want to return a view from your controller. Return view pages.about. Okay, so if you remember, we go into the resources views folder. We already have a pages folder from last time, but I'll create a new one. About.played.php. And once again, I'm going to hard code a bunch of HTML here. But right now, I want you to be thinking about how this doesn't scale very well. If I added a style sheet here, Well, in its current state, I would have to add it here, and then any other view that I've created as well. Not a good idea, but we'll talk about that more in a future lesson. If you'd like to work ahead though, research master pages, or layout files, as some people refer to them. All right, so we'll say about me, and then add a little bit of lorem ipsum text. And if we come back, refresh, we have the beginnings of a website. But now what about passing variables to our view? Remember, your view should more or less be kind of dumb. It shouldn't be talking to an application service or fetching rows directly from a database table or something like that. Instead, we give it anything that it needs. Think of it like this. We say hello to the view, we give the view a collection of blog posts, and then the view filters through those blog posts and displays them on the page. Notice that at no point in that conversation or that dialogue did the view itself go to the database store and fetch those posts. It was just given that. So don't forget that idea. It's a common mistake and really makes for muddy and confusing code. Okay, so let's go back to Pages controller, and let's just say we want to pass through our name. Very simple, right? Well, name, and we'll do myself, Jeffrey Way. And now I want to pass this to the view. And we have a couple different ways to do that, depending upon your preference. I'll show you two. We could say with, load this view with this data, with name, which is equal to this variable. Okay, before I show you some alternatives, let's make sure it works. About me, and now how do I echo out the person's name? Well, you know how to do it like this, right? Let's see if that works. Come back, refresh, and there we go. There's the variable. However, we're using Laravel here, and I mentioned in the previous video this idea of Laravel's Blade engine. Basically what that translates to is we have a nice syntax we can use that will ultimately be compiled down to basic PHP, but it makes it a lot easier to work with. Yes, PHP has templating capabilities, but they didn't grow to be very good. So instead, Laravel's Blade makes this a lot more fun to write. Here's how. For escaped data, we just wrap the variable name within two braces. That's equivalent to us manually escaping the data and echoing it out. Now though, if you want unescaped data, then you would do this syntax right here. Brace, the name, and then we close it out. And maybe a demonstration would make that a little more clear. Let me show you. If we go back to Pages controller, and maybe we make the style is color red. You know, maybe this comes from a database or something, just to give you an idea. Now, if we come back and refresh, and we see it's red, and that's because we didn't escape it. And you gotta be careful with this, especially when, as an example, somebody fills out a form. Well, what if they wrote some JavaScript within that form? Within the text area, they did something like this. That's the sort of stuff that you have to be careful about. So really think about whether you want to escape this data or not. As a general rule of thumb, escape it unless proven otherwise, or you have a reason not to. So let's go back to our About page, and if I show you the difference, now we're going to escape it, and if I come back, you'll actually see the HTML there. So it's more of a secure default. Okay, so let's continue. Back to Pages controller. That's one way we could do it, but what if we wanted to pass through more than one variable? We want to pass an array. Okay, just like this. No difference. So how about we say first is Jeffrey, and last will be equal to Way, and we'll get rid of that. All right, now let's do first, followed by space, and then last. We come back, we refresh, and now we're passing through multiple variables. So just to clarify how that works, when you pass through an array, every key will be translated into the name of the variable, and every value will of course be the value for the variable. All right, so that's the second way. A third option would be to pass an array of data as the second argument to the view function. Now, if you're coming from a different framework like CodeIgniter, this might look more familiar to you. So in that case, we could say data equals an array, data first equals Douglas, and data last equals Quaid. Now, if we come back, we're still going to get the exact same thing. And a lot of people prefer this approach. For me, though, unless I'm dealing with a lot of data, something that I actually like to do is to write out my variables. So first will be about Fox, and last will be Mulder. Well, yes, I could do an array and manually fill that out, or we can use PHP's compact function, like this, first, last. Now, if you're not familiar with compact, the way that works is it will take each key and try to find a variable with that same name. So in this case, it'll find that, and then it'll build up an associative array. So if we try that approach, of course, it's still going to work. And that's what I like to do, because many times you really are just passing through maybe one variable to the view. So I think that's a pretty clean approach. But if you instead like to do the with option, no problem there whatsoever. It just comes down to taste. All right, that'll do it for this video. Once you feel comfortable, as always, we'll move on to the next video.